Welcome back, everyone, for another deep dive. You've been exploring the impact of environmental toxins on human health, and today we're zeroing in on reproductive health.
A topic with so many
It
layers.
really is. We've got two pretty dense academic review papers to untangle, one that focuses specifically on endocrine disruptors, those are the EDCs found in water,
Right.
and then another paper that takes a broader view and looks at how EDCs impact a whole range of health outcomes.
So, sounds like a lot to cover.
It is. But let's see what we can uncover. What jumps out at you from these papers?
Well, both papers start by throwing out a pretty startling stat about infertility.
Yeah, 1 in 8 couples trying for their first child.
Yeah, and then 1 in 6 for subsequent children.
Which is wild, right? It really hits home how widespread this issue is.
Yeah, it really underscores why it's so crucial for us to understand the role that things like EDCs might be playing.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So before we get into the specifics, can you give us a quick refresher on what EDCs are and why they're considered such a potential threat to reproductive health?
Sure. So EDCs are basically chemicals that can either mimic or block the actions of our hormones.
Uh-huh.
And those hormones, obviously, they play a critical role in all sorts of reproductive processes.
It's crazy how these tiny molecules can have such huge downstream effects.
Oh, absolutely. The concern with EDCs is that they can really disrupt this delicate balance that our bodies have when it comes to hormones, and that can impact, the very foundation of reproductive health.
One of the papers really hones in on EDCs that are found in our water, which is a little unnerving.
Yeah, it is. We often take clean water for granted, but it's a major potential pathway for these chemicals to get into our bodies.
It is. The paper delves into these things called disinfection byproducts, or DBPs for short.
Right.
You explain what those are?
Yeah, so DBPs are kind of an ironic consequence of our efforts to treat water. When we disinfect water to kill harmful bacteria, we use things like chlorine. And during that process, new chemical compounds can form, and those are the DBPs. And some of them have been linked to reproductive issues, at least in animal studies.
And even at low concentrations, right?
Yeah. Yeah, which raises some questions about whether our drinking water is as safe as we assume it to be.
It's kind of like our efforts to make water safe might be unintentionally introducing new risks.
Yeah, it's definitely something that requires more investigation, but it just highlights the complexity of trying to ensure safe drinking water.
Absolutely.
Okay.
So then there are PFA, those infamous forever chemicals. They seem to be everywhere. And this paper highlights some pretty worrisome findings about their impact on fertility.
Yeah, the research on PFAS and reproductive health is definitely growing.
One study mentioned in the paper found that men who had high combined levels of PFOS and PFOA had significantly lower sperm counts compared to men with low levels.
Oh, yeah, that was a pretty striking
About
finding.
40% lower.
Yeah, which really underscores the potential impact of these chemicals on male reproductive health.
Then there's BPA, another EDC that we hear a lot about, often in the context of plastics. But this paper suggests its effects go way beyond just plastic.
Yeah, for sure. BPA can actually interfere with hormonal signaling pathways in our bodies, which means it can potentially affect everything from sperm quality to ovulation and even increase the risk of certain types of cancer.
And it seems like BPA is in everything these days. Food packaging receipts, even some dental sealants. Avoiding it feels almost impossible.
Yeah, it does take a conscious effort to minimize exposure given how ubiquitous it is.
So what about phthalates? They're used to make plastics more flexible, right?
That's right. And they're found in an incredible range of products, cosmetics, toys, flooring, you name it.
The paper mentions that in animal studies, phthalate exposure has been linked to a whole slew of reproductive issues. Reduced sperm quality, premature ovarian failure. The list goes on.
Yeah, well, more research is definitely needed to understand the full extent of the effects in humans. Those findings are certainly concerning.
For sure. And then there's the issue of pesticide contamination in our water, which the paper also touches on.
Right.
It seems like our reproductive systems are under attack from all sides.
Unfortunately, pesticides are often designed to disrupt biological processes, and those effects can sometimes unintentionally extend to humans.
One pesticide that stood out to me was atrazine, which is a widely used herbicide.
Yeah, atrazine is a known endocrine disruptor.
And research suggests that it can disrupt hormone levels and reproductive development in animals.
Exactly. So its presence in our water systems is definitely a cause for concern.
Now get this, the second paper we're looking at delves into some really fascinating territory. It explores the potential impact of EDCs on our very DNA.
Yeah, now that's where things get really interesting.
Right. Like DNA is the blueprint of life.
hmm
How can EDCs mess with that?
Well, some EDCs can interfere with a process called DNA methylation,
Oh
which
boy.
is kind of like attaching or removing tiny flags in your DNA. And these flags can actually change how your genes are expressed, whether they're turned on or off, essentially.
So exposure to EDCs could be altering the way our genes work.
That's the worry. And these changes can have significant long-term consequences for reproductive health, potentially affecting not just the individual who's exposed, but also future generations.
That's pretty mind-blowing.
Yeah.
I think we need to delve deeper into those implications in part 2 of our deep dive.
I'm with you. There's a lot more to unpack here. This idea that our environment could actually be altering our DNA. I mean, it's one of the more thought-provoking aspects of this research.
It really is.
Yeah.
And it kind of makes you realize that we're not just talking about immediate health effects here, right?
Yeah.
We're talking about potential consequences that could impact, generations to come.
Exactly.
So where do we go from here? I mean, it's easy to feel overwhelmed by all this information and wonder what we can actually do to protect ourselves and future generations.
I get that. I think the key is not to get bogged down in fear, but to really empower ourselves with knowledge.
Knowledge is power, right?
Exactly. One of the most important things we can do is advocate for stricter regulations on the production and use of these harmful chemicals.
So systemic change is really what needs to happen.
Absolutely. We need policies that prioritize human health and environmental protection over corporate profits.
But while we're working towards those larger scale changes, are there things we can do as individuals to minimize our exposure?
Yeah, there are definitely steps we can take to reduce our contact with EDCs.
Like what? Give us some examples.
Well, choosing glass or stainless steel containers over plastic whenever possible. That's a big one.
Yeah, that's one I've been trying to be more mindful of.
It makes a difference. You can also look for personal care products that are labeled phthalate-free.
I'll have to start paying more attention to those labels.
It's worth it. And when it comes to food, make sure you're washing your fruits and vegetables thoroughly. And consider buying organic when you can, especially for produce that's known to have higher pesticide residues.
All good tips. Okay, so back to those potential long-term consequences. The second paper dives deeper into this concept of transgenerational effects, which honestly sounds kind of like science fiction.
It does sound a little futuristic, doesn't it? But the science behind it is pretty compelling.
Can you break it down for us? What exactly do we mean by transgenerational effects in this context?
Well, it's the idea that exposure to certain EDCs during these critical windows of development, like in the womb or early childhood, can have these ripple effects that extend way beyond the individual who is directly exposed.
So like my grandmother's exposure to DET, decades ago, could theoretically be impacting my health today.
It's not impossible. The research suggests that EDCs can actually alter those chemical tags on our DNA, the ones we talked about earlier, and those changes can be passed down to future generations.
Those tiny flags that control whether genes are turned on or off.
Exactly. And that means that exposure to EDCs in one generation could potentially predispose future generations to certain health problems, including, reproductive issues.
It's a pretty sobering thought.
Yeah,
It makes you realize how interconnected human health is across generations.
it really does. And it highlights the responsibility we have to consider not just our own well-being, but the well-being of those who come after us.
It's a powerful reminder that the choices we make today have these ripple effects that can last for generations.
Absolutely.
Speaking of choices, we've focused a lot on the potential negative effects of EDCs, but are there any positive takeaways from this research? Any reasons for optimism?
There are. I think one of the most encouraging things is that we're becoming increasingly aware of this problem. The research in this area is growing rapidly.
So scientists are on the case.
They are. And that research is giving us a better understanding of these chemicals and hopefully leading to more effective strategies to mitigate the risks.
That's good to hear. And what about those individual actions we talked about earlier? Do they actually make a difference, in the grand scheme of things?
Absolutely. Every choice we make, from the products we buy to the food we eat, it all contributes to a collective shift.
So it's not about feeling powerless, but about recognizing that we do have agency.
Exactly. And when enough people start demanding safer products and pushing for stricter regulations, real change can happen.
It's a reminder that individual actions can create a ripple effect that leads to broader systemic change.
Precisely. It's a long game, but it's a game worth playing.
Well said. I think that's a great place to wrap up part 2 of our deep dive into EDCs and reproductive health. We've covered a lot of ground, but there's still more to explore. In part 3, we'll delve into some of the broader societal implications of this issue. And we're back for the final part of our deep dive into EDCs and reproductive health. We've really dug into the science, the potential impacts, and even touched on those mind-blowing transgenerational effects.
Yeah, it's been quite a journey.
It has. But now let's zoom out a bit and consider the wider societal implications of all this.
Yeah, it's important to remember that this isn't just an abstract scientific issue, right? It has real-world consequences for individuals, for families, for entire communities.
Exactly. I mean, when we talk about things like declining fertility rates, it's easy to get caught up in the personal struggles, but there are also these broader economic and social ramifications to think about.
Absolutely. A shrinking workforce can put a strain on things like social safety nets and ultimately impact economic growth.
Right.
And the financial burden of infertility treatments can be significant for couples.
Yeah, adding another layer of stress to an already difficult situation.
For sure.
It really is a complex issue with these far-reaching consequences. And it makes you wonder about the long-term implications for society as a whole. Like if people are increasingly worried about their ability to have children, how might that affect their life choices and their overall outlook on the future?
It's a huge question, and it's something that researchers and social scientists are definitely grappling with as we navigate these changing demographics and evolving social norms.
It feels like we're in uncharted territory in a lot of ways.
Right.
I mean, we've introduced so many new chemicals into our environment in such a short period of time, and we're only beginning to understand the potential consequences.
It's true, and it's a humbling reminder of how much we still don't know and how important it is to approach this whole issue with caution and a strong sense of responsibility.
Speaking of responsibility, where do we go from here? What can we actually do to address this complex web of challenges?
Well, I think it's going to require a multifaceted approach, for sure. First and foremost, we need continued investment in research so we can better understand the specific effects of different EDCs and identify safer alternatives.
So more knowledge is key.
Absolutely. But knowledge alone isn't enough. We need to translate that knowledge into action. And that means advocating for stronger regulations and policies that prioritize human health and environmental protection over, corporate profits.
And holding industries accountable for producing safer products.
Exactly. It's about creating a system that encourages both innovation and responsibility, where companies are actually incentivized to create products that are both effective and safe.
And it seems like educating consumers plays a vital role in this too. The more people understand about EDCs and their potential impacts, the more likely they are to make informed choices and demand change.
100%. Empowering consumers is essential. It's about giving them the knowledge they need to navigate this complex landscape and advocate for their own health and the health of future generations.
Well, this deep dive has been a real eye-opener. It's clear that EDCs are a serious issue with some pretty significant implications, but it's also clear that we're not powerless.
That's the important takeaway.
We can make choices both individually and collectively to mitigate the risks and hopefully create a healthier future for ourselves and for generations to come.
Couldn't agree more.
So we hope this conversation has given you some food for thought and maybe even inspires you to take action. Remember, even small changes can have a ripple effect. So thanks for joining us on this deep dive into EDCs and reproductive health.